皆様、本日お忙しい中、国立教育政策研究所令和3年度教育改革国際シンポジウム、これからの世界における教育データの可能性を探るにご参加いただきまして誠にありがとうございます。申し遅れましたが、私、本日司会進行を務めます木村ティーナ智子と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。では、開会にあたりまして、国立教育政策研究所所長、浅田和伸よりご挨拶申し上げます。
皆さん、こんにちは。文部科学省国立教育政策研究所所長の浅田です。教育改革国際シンポジウムの開催にあたり、主催者としてご挨拶を申し上げます。今回は新型コロナウイルス感染症への対応として、オンラインでの開催とさせていただきました。日本だけでなく、世界中から参加申し込みをいただいています。ご登壇いただく皆様、ご参加くださる皆様、また準備にあたってくださったすべての皆様に心より御礼を申し上げます。どうもありがとうございます。特に大変お忙しい中、また日本との時差にもかかわらず、国外からもご参加くださる方々が大勢います。本当にありがとうございます。皆様のご協力のおかげで、国際シンポジウムにふさわしい充実したプログラムとすることができました。この教育改革国際シンポジウムは、国立教育政策研究所が国際的な視点から教育改革をめぐるさまざまな論点に焦点を当てて、議論を促進することを目的としています。今年のテーマは、これからの世界における教育データの可能性を探るとしました。今日、ビッグデータ時代の到来に伴い、日本のみならず世界においてデータサイエンスが注目を集めています。もちろん、教育分野も例外ではありません。日本では政策レベルにおいて、文部科学省に教育データの利活用に関する有識者会議が設置され、本年3月に教育データの利活用にかかる論点整理の中間まとめがなされました。そこでは、教育データの定義、その利活用の原則、目的、視点などについて言及されています。また、教育データをどのように子どもたちの学びに活用できるのか、教師や学校をいかに支援するべきかなど、さまざまな重要な論点も示されています。国立教育政策研究所は、教育分野における日本の代表機関として、昭和36年、1961年に国際教育到達度評価学会 IEA に加盟をし、IEA が実施する国際共同研究調査である国際数学理科教育動向調査 TIMSS にも参加してまいりました。IEA は義務教育段階における国際的な学力調査などに取り組んでおり、教育データの取り扱いに関しても多くの経験や知見を有しています。それらを国立教育政策研究所が参画する国際ネットワークの重要な成果の一つとして位置づけ、皆様と共有できるシンポジウムを開催することは、教育データサイエンスをめぐる諸課題の発見・解決の上でも大きな意義があると考えました。本日は教育データサイエンスに関し、学力調査という具体的な切り口から、IEA の関係者によるご講演、事例紹介、パネルディスカッションなどを行います。それらを通じ、国立教育政策研究所、IEA 参加者の皆様方が、長年の取り組みを通じて蓄積してこられた貴重な経験や知見を共有し合い、将来に向けた教育データサイエンスの展望や課題について 考察を深めていくことにつなげたいと考えています。ご登壇いただく方が多くの国、地域にわたるため、時差の事情もあり、プログラム全体で2時間半という濃縮した時間の設定とさせていただきました。本日のシンポジウムが参加者の皆様にとって有益なかつ密度の濃い時間となりますこと、また IEA と国立教育政策研究所との協力関係の発展につながりますことを心から願っています。以上で主催者としての開会挨拶といたします。本日はどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
それでは続きまして IEA 本部事務総長ドクターダルク・ハステッド様からご挨拶を頂戴いたします。
I would like to start by thanking the National Institute for Educational Policy Research and Director General Mr. Assad Katsunobu for inviting me and other IEA representatives to join today's symposium to reflect on this topic of exploring the possibility of educational data for a sustainable future. While I'm really saddened not to be joining today's session in Japan in person, as originally planned, I am delighted to be part of today's event, at least virtually. Today also concludes the highly collaborative and productive 3 days of IEA's General Assembly sessions, which took place in the first half of this week. During this year's IEA General Assembly, or GA, we released some unique publications, including a new findings from the TIMSS 2019 Problem and Trial Task, which Dr. Ina Mullis and Dr. Michael Martin will present more on in today's special session. This publication is a major milestone in the history of TIMSS, provide a wealth of data for future research, and will enable a series of further in-depth analysis. The report provides more comprehensive coverage of problem solving and inquiry while making it possible to collect valuable process data out about the ways students proceed through an assessment session. Process data on event time, navigation from screen to screen, scrolling, and the use of calculators and rulers were particularly useful in analyzing non-response data. This distinguishes between students who ran out of time and those who stopped responding before time was up. I would like to thank colleagues at the TIMSS and Pearls International Study Center at Boston College for their valuable work on this report. I think they have done an excellent job at providing a much needed overview, and I encourage interested researchers to dive into the open access data that are available now for deeper insights. The future of IEA is characterized by the fact that existing surveys are gradually being converted from paper-based testing to computer-based assessment. This includes new possibilities, such as the use of new item formats, the acquisition of new, previously immeasurable constructs, the acquisition of process data that were previously unavailable, the application and development of new scaling and analysis methods, as well as opportunities for more efficient surveys. But challenges remain, and some new ones also rise in the step towards digital assessment. As part of this, and after the success of IEA's first Beyond Result workshop held in 2020, a second edition was hosted at the end of September, 1 month ago. The workshop series is a collaboration with colleagues from DIP and SIP in Germany. It offers a virtual format in which the latest research on the collection, processing analysis, and interpretation of process data can be presented and discussed annually. This year's focus was on the theory-based construction of process indicators. And we are looking forward to hosting the following workshop in 2022. Collaboration is a core part of how we work at IEA. And these types of sessions are important in order to navigate the new opportunities and challenges that arise from the growth of digital assessments. Evidence for International Large-Scale Assessment, or ILSAS, can be a valuable tool for monitoring educational systems and improving education. Today, it is difficult to imagine that a policymaker might put a new policy into practice without any evidence that such a change will enhance or positively contribute to the education system. Both policymakers and researchers must collaborate to promote policymaking and solutions to educational problems, such as improving students' mathematics learning attitudes and motivation, or enabling all children and young people to participate in a digitalized world. However, we need to be sure not to overinterpret results and keep seeing achievement result measures by ILSAs as indicators and not as targets of education. ILSA's results serve as an important indicator, enabling countries to monitor whether new policies improve educational problems and identify possible directions and topics to work on. Thank you once again to NIER for inviting me to attend today. I wish all participants a day of fruitful and collaborative sessions. Thank you.
それでは講演の部に入らせていただきます。まず IEA 総会議長ドクターティエリ・ロシェ様の基調講演です。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank NIER to invite us to this symposium. I'm very happy to attend to this symposium, even virtually and not in person as it was planned. This symposium comes at the end of our General Assembly of the IEA, the association. And I want to give you a short talk to talk to you more a bit about our association, IEA, as the IEA elected chairperson. And I will show you the long tradition, long history in terms of collecting data within our association, and give you also some example of innovative features, innovative ways of collecting data within the context of IEA and in my national context, which is France, because I'm working at the French Ministry of Education Statistical Department in France. Thank you again for inviting us. Just an introduction, if you don't know IEA and our association, IEA stands for International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. It's a non-governmental research organization. It was founded in 1958. We are independent. We are an international cooperative of national research institution and governmental research agency. And our main core activities, to say, is to conduct large-scale comparative studies of educational achievement and other aspects of education. We are more than 60 member country institutions, and in our studies, there are nearly about 100 education systems participating in IEA. Just to show you the list here of our 66 members today, and of course, Japan is a dear member of our association. But what is our mission? We conduct, of course, large-scale studies. That's the main activity, but to do what? To better understand education practices, processes, and policies, and with the aim of improving the quality of teaching and learning. We are a research-based organization. This is the key word for our association. And as researchers, we also have a big concern on the topic of linking research with policy and practice. And another thing as well, very important for you to know, is that we made all our data publicly available online, and it can be shared in the research community around the world. And I invite you to visit our website. I just put the address here on my slide. Just to show you this map, I'm not sure you can see very clearly, but it's just to give you an overview of all the studies that IEA has been conducted since 1959. That means more than 60 years now. with a lot of experience, a long and strong tradition in terms of international comparison in the field of student assessment, which is why it's very important to rely on all this story, all we have learned over these past decades regarding comparative studies, regarding collecting large-scale assessment data, and it's more than important to have in mind all this experience in order to better innovate in the future. Our current studies nowadays, the main studies that we conduct at an international level are TIMSS, and you will hear our colleague from Boston College presented to you innovative activities regarding these studies. TIMSS assess math and science, and we have trend data, comparative historical data since 1995 in grade 4 and grade 8. PEARS assess reading comprehension and in grade 4, and we have trends since 2001. ICCS, International Civic and Citizenship Studies, that we conduct grade 8, and we have trends since 2009. And finally, ICLS, the International Computer Information Literacy Study. And for this study, we have trends since 2013. As you can see, we have a long historical data that are very valuable in order to monitor education system results. There are other international comparisons study in the world, of course. One of our, I would say, our key aspects regarding IEA studies is that we are really curriculum grounded in terms of student assessment, and we have this model that we have since the beginning of our studies decades ago with a model around the curriculum. That means paying a lot of attention to what is intended in terms of curriculum in a country, what is implemented. So that means our assessment, our studies also addresses a lot of questionnaires about the context at the school level, teacher level, classroom level, which is really important to understand what's going on when we want to understand a bit more the results. And we have the attained curriculum. That means, of course, the student outcomes that we measure with our standardized assessment. I would like to invite you to consult a Compass Brief, which is a short publication that we publish at IEA. And here I put the image that you can see. There is a Japanese translation on our website. So I would strongly invite you to read this Compass Brief that we wrote together with Dirk, Hastedt. And it is about a description of the international assessment studies and how IEA is specific in terms of missions, in terms of quality of the data we are measuring. So this was really a short overview about the long tradition, long history that we have in the field of student assessment. And now I want to talk to you more to relate with the theme of the symposium today, which is about educational data and a big shift, of course, that we experience. We see that there is an experience all around the world in many countries about the transition from paper-based assessment to digitally based assessment. And I have to say that IEA studies are very well advanced on this path, and they are at the forefront, and with quite a tricky objective, which is to maintain this tradition, to maintain and to preserve the trends, and to be able to compare the progress over time of different education systems, and while developing innovations, because there is a need to develop this innovation. I will just show you some example. Thanks to the technology, we can learn a lot more than with paper-based testing program. There are many challenges, of course, doing so and implementing digitally based assessment, but I'm personally convinced, and I'm not the only one, I think the association is quite shared, that there are also much more opportunities in this journey. So I just want to give you two examples, not to be too long, but give you examples about, in terms of innovative items, what we can, what are some advantage we can have with some digitally based items, and give you another example in the French context about what we can learn with the so-called process data. So first, as I said, my colleagues from Boston College represent some innovative items regarding TIMSS. I just want to show you in the frame of ICLS, the International Computer and Information Literacy Study, innovative item regarding the assessment of computational thinking. So here in this example, you can see it's an environment. Maybe for those of you, it may look familiar because many students around the world can be taught on this kind of environment, which is a block programming environment. And so students are asked to program the movement here of a drone in the context of a farm. So they have to manipulate, they can test their code, they can debug their code, they can try, etc. So that's something really very close from a coding, a programming experience. And of course, this kind of item, we can invent some paper-based assessment regarding this kind of items and asking question, how would you do the programming, etc. But we would be really not in an ecological, let's say, environment perspective. Here, the students are really put in a real experience of programming. So these innovative items, just digitally, the move to digitally based assessment is really key if we want to address this kind of 21st century skills. Nowadays, it's something very important, of course, to consider. Now I would like to show you, talk to you about an example of what we could learn from the so-called process data, because this item, just the one I just showed you, we can gather a lot of data, much more than classical items like multiple choice question, for example. So here, I just want to give you some very short summary of an article that was published in a journal co-edited by IEA, by the way, which is large-scale assessments in education. And the title is quite meaningful because it's when didactics meets data science. And today, one of your themes is data science, but I want to raise the attention that it's really important to be very theory-grounded, and that's why this article is about, is to be able to have this meeting between theory and data science. So the item that was used in this article, analyzed in this article, is a math item, and we asked the students to manipulate. As you can see, it has a spreadsheet and a graph, and the task it has to find the age, which is on the x-axis on the graph, and the age at which the two trees will have the same height, which is on the y-axis. And then it can try some values, it can draw some lines, and then to be able to find these crossing points. So this, in a few seconds, this is kind of data we can collect. It's not well structured. It's because students are quite free to do many kind of actions. So the key question is regarding this so-called process data is to be able to answer the question, is there a signal in this a lot of noisy data? And I won't be able to go into a lot of details, but then I would encourage you to read this article if you're interested in. But the key idea is that the article relies on quite a robust framework in didactics, which is about the function and how students understand what is a function. And there can be basically two approaches. One is structural, because students may have an idea of what is a function on a more formal mathematical level, but there is also an operational approach, which is much simpler approach when students have an idea of a function like an input and an output. And in these two approaches do not necessarily lead to a success or a failure. You can have a different approach with different success. So using some data indicators, for example, if the students use a pen or not, or how many values they enter in the spreadsheet, etc. So using this kind of indicators, we can see on the right hand side, there are many indicators that distinguish here 4 classes of students. And I have to say it's very promising. It's an early step in understanding the cognitive profile of students. And it may be very helpful, not only for large-scale student assessment, but also for teachers directly to profiling their students. So that was my example about process data. There are many more to come, but my conviction, of course, is also that we need more evidence, more validation studies. We need also more international collaboration, and I'm very pleased to say that IEA is leading, as Dirk mentioned before me, a workshop regarding these very innovative questions, and then there will be the setting up of working group in the future. And this working group also, there is a need for them to be interdisciplinary oriented, because there are many, let's say, domains and fields of research to think about when we collect this kind of process data and when we want to know more and extract relevant information for this process data. So I'm very excited about the future in this area, and even if we are at the beginning of a journey, it's a very, very stimulating journey from my perspective. Thank you again for welcoming us to your symposium. I really wish you a very productive symposium. Thank you very much again to IER.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rocher. ありがとうございました。続きましては、デンマークのドクター・クリスチャン・キールセンのテーマ講演です。よろしくお願いいたします。
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to talk about opportunities and barriers when we use educational data for development of both practice, educational policy, and research. And the main question that drives my presentation is whether or not one measure for all or a national coherent assessment program will be the answer for future development within countries. It should be no secret that educational data should be knowledge that benefits society, which is actually one of the values of our university here in Denmark. So the short agenda, what are the barriers, the enablers and the disablers of educational development while using educational data? And what I will do, I will give a national perspective on these things with the case of Denmark. So actually, I would end up arguing for going into and develop more of the international large-scale assessments, because I see them as the opportunity for national development. So even though I will go beyond the IEA studies in my presentation, shortly myself, then the development of data-driven development with the case of Denmark, I will tried to discuss what I would call a mismatch between political, educational, and practical expectations towards the data and data use and the rules of what I call the physics of psychometric properties, and then come with a few recommendations. So at the moment, I'm the Vice Deputy Director of Research at the Danish School of Education, Center Director for National Center for School Research at Aarhus University. So my students nowadays look like this on a summer day in Aarhus, but actually I have a background as a teacher first with main subjects in music and physics, and then a master in sociology, and did a doctoral work in Germany. So at that time, the students looked more like this, and perhaps they just grew up and went from one setting to the other one. But in order to do so, we would have to support them through schooling. In Denmark, we have a compulsory schooling from the 1st to the 9th grade called Folkeskolen, and we do not have any high-stake testing when pupils need to go from one grade to the other grade. And it's interesting in this setting that around the 1960s, we had at our institution, the former DPI, the Danish statistician Rasch, who actually introduced what is well known as the RAS model today, and so to speak, soiled the ground for the way we do all the international scaling and assessments these years. So, and very early on in Denmark, the different tests that was used in the educational system were standardized and RAS model approved. So, and then in the actually in the mid 2006, it was voted in favor in Denmark to introduce what we call the national tests, and that was national IT-based adaptive testing. So it was a test system that took advantage of the RAS modeling and also what we've learned through the international studies over time, but did it fully adaptive and fully IT-based. And there were some troubles in the start, but then from 2010, it went on. And actually it was a representative from the Ministry of Education that went to Norway and saw how they did it. And then they wanted to develop this test, and it should rely on all the known psychometric properties and modeling that we know from the large scale assessments, which is a kind of securing the quality of the data. And I think that's a key issue, that educational data is not just data. The use of the data depends on good quality. And now we've developed in the national test in Denmark, we developed it for Danish, which is actually reading for the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, and the 8th grade, English in the 7th grade, mathematics 3rd and the 6th grade, geography in 8th grade, biology in 8th grade, and physics and chemistry also in the 8th grade. And in between the grades, it's voluntary for the teachers to take the test as well. So because it's fully adaptive, a 3rd grade student could take the 2nd grade mathematics or in the 1st grade. So, and each domain measure 3 areas. But after more than 10 years of testing with this system, it was evaluated, and the conclusion was quite clear that these national tests, they were designed to both be an educational tool for the teachers, and at the same time a management system which could follow the trend of development within schools on a municipality level and also on the national level. And this dual purpose makes it challenging. Actually, it turns out that in order to use it on a student level, on a pupils level, for the teachers, it's way too uncertain. So on a class and individual level, it became too inaccurate to meet the educational need for a more data-informed development and progress of students. And then actually it should be no surprise, because as Mark Wu already in 2010 point out, is that when you track individual students, even though you use a very standardized and high quality test, due to what I've called the physics of psychrometrics and probability, it turns out that on a 40-item test, it is expected that 15% of the students would, on the test, even though they did move ahead and had a normal gain of knowledge over a year, they would still test, and it would look like they had a backward regression in their knowledge. And when I do the same with the national test in Denmark, the national test in Denmark had a standard error of measurement around 0.555. Because even though it's fully adaptive and took the advantage of really targeting the items to the individual student, it turns out that over these 20 items, it was nearly 0.5 in standard error measurement. That makes a difference, because if we assume that we use it on an individual level in schools to follow the process or the progress of a student, and if we assume that what Hattie calls the hinge point, I mean the development, the mean difference in development over a year of 0.4, then actually 29% will still have a result on the test, even though they are actually in real life, I mean, are getting better. They would still get a measurement that is a test result that is lower than the first result. That is actually an important thing to have knowledge about when thinking about doing national testing and national assessments, and if one want to use it on the student level or in the classroom by the teachers, is even though you have a very good test, the uncertainty on the test, if you will not, I mean, else you will have to test the students over many hours in order to have a better error. So if the students actually have a progression in knowledge over a year of the hinge points, 0.4, 29% would still on the test get a lower result a year after than the first. Not because they are not learning, only because of probability and the error of the test. So actually, in Denmark, this has been a central part of the public debate on the national tests. And we established, because we have the opportunity to put together the data from different sources of data, because each person in Denmark have a personal identification number, CPR number. So there is a data warehouse built up for teachers and also for policymakers, decision makers, and it contains a lot of dense information on a school level, on a class level, on an individual level, and they are all publicly available. And I put in so you can see it if you want to play around with it afterwards. It's a data warehouse and with an Excel entrance, so you could put together your own tables. So, but the main problem when going this way is that when the collected data is to be used by the professionals, they also do not have the capacity to understand these data. So even though it's much more data-driven, much more data-informed, they are not able to investigate it and to understand it, and they have no ideas about the statistical error of the measurement, etc. So they take it as a face value. They say, okay, then the student must have been regressing in knowledge, even though it's more likely due to the error of the test. So there seems to be a mismatch between the properties of data and the use for it. There are different demands when you use it for research, when you use it on a practical level for individual teaching and supporting students, and then for policy making. So my recommendation, I would recommend actually that if one need to do to move ahead in the future for a more data-driven development of the educational system, one will need to develop what I call a consistent and coherent program of assessments and other data. So on the macro level for policymaking and research, the sample-based assessments, which we have in the international large-scale assessments, they are reliable, they're valid, and they can measure trends over time and address different important questions due to the very rich context questionnaires. So they are suitable for the macro level and policymaking and research. Whereas on the meso level, one need to use other types of data, census information on students, well-being, teachers, etc. And on the educational level, once again, a new type of data, a new form of information will be needed. And there I would suggest what I call a toolbox of standardized tests with good documentation, good psychometric properties, but that is suitable and actually made for everyday use by teachers on a student's level, and then make space for what I call the professional judgment of the teachers, who to use it on, etc. And also one need to develop a data literacy on all levels. On the micro level, teachers really need to understand the limits of the test they apply and have some basic knowledge on test administration, statistical error, etc. On the meso level, policymakers need to have a broad insight in these data sources that can inform the decision and be aware that there are differences between significance in a statistical sense and what is substantial importance. So not everything that is statistically significant make a substantial difference. And on the macro level, results from educational data have to be communicated with an emphasis on the confidence and limitations. And I would argue for democratic discussion on what data is gathered. So you kind of have a discussion on a macro level on what Amartya Sen calls the informational basis for the judgment of justice, because data kind of shape the decisions we made, so it makes a difference which kind of data we gather. So thank you for letting me present this, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kjeldsen. ありがとうございました。 続きましては事例紹介ケーススタディの部に入らせていただきます。まず TIMSS 国際本部ドクターアイナ・ミリス、そしてドクターマイケル・マーティンに TIMSS という取り組みのご説明をお願いいたします。
So I am going to provide a very brief overview of the development and evolution of TIMSS over the last 28 years, and then Ina will talk about our findings from the problem-solving inquiry tasks that we have just published. So TIMSS 23, which is the current version of TIMSS, represents 28 years of international trends in mathematics and science achievement, curriculum, and instruction. TIMSS began its first data collection in 1995, what we now call the inaugural assessment. At that time, TIMSS was called the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, and it was the first really well-funded large-scale international assessment. IEA had participated in many assessments before that, as you could see from Thierry's slide, but TIMSS really was the first one. It had very generous funding from the United States, more than $10 million, which in 1995 was an enormous amount of money for an international study. And the only task before us was to do a very good job. It was an extremely ambitious endeavor. The planning and development took more than 4 years. And it assessed for the first time mathematics and science together. It also coincided with the time when many countries suddenly began to look outward for their educational systems. Almost 40 countries signed up to participate in TIMSS. TIMSS assessed mathematics and science at 5 grade levels. The lower one was the 2 adjacent grades with the most 9-year-olds. This was 3rd and 4th grade in most countries. Then we had the 2 adjacent grades with most 13-year-olds, which were 7th and 8th grade in most countries. And then finally, the final year of secondary school, where we had an assessment of general mathematics and science literacy, and also specialized assessments for students in mathematics, in advanced mathematics and in physics. This, as well as an assessment of mathematics and science, TIMSS also had an in-depth analysis of mathematics and science curriculum. This was a very ambitious exercise carried out by Dr. William Schmidt. It also consisted of a state-of-the-art performance assessment where students did practical tasks in a circus-like assessment. And also we had extensive questionnaires for students, teachers, and school principals. And the diagram on the right shows the complex conceptual map we had driving the development of the questionnaires. In addition to all of this, we also had in-depth studies in 3 countries, in the United States, in Germany, and in Japan, I'm very happy to say. These consisted of a video study of mathematics and classroom instruction conducted by Dr. Jim Stigler, and the case studies of educational policy issues also, very detailed case studies. So in reporting the results of TIMSS 95, there were at least 9 major international reports just coming from the Boston College International Studies Center. We had 4 technical reports, and of course we had a large international database and user guide, which is made available to the entire world to work on the data. Although TIMSS 95 was designed to be a once-off assessment, just one sort of a snapshot of student achievement at all the levels, there was provision for the possibility of repeating it. So this was also known as TIMSS Repeat because it was essentially a repeat of the TIMSS 95 assessment. We made new items to replace the ones we had released in 95 and then conducted our first measurement of change, as I was saying. This was conducted at the 8th grade only, and it was 4 years after 95. So this allowed us to analyze changes from the 8th grade students in 1995 compared to the 8th grade students in 1999. And because the 4th grade students in 95 were now the 8th grade students in 99, we also could look at changes in this cohort over the 4 years. Another interesting development in TIMSS 1999 was the first benchmarking effort. So the United States decided, as well as participating as a country in the TIMSS assessment, it also could make available to individual United States and school districts the possibility to participate as if they were countries. So this is called benchmarking. So you could benchmark your state or your school district against international research, international achievement around the world. So 13 US states and 14 school districts and consortia participated in this. And ever since then, we have had benchmarking participants in TIMSS from time to time. In the years 2003 and 2007, there was a major reorientation of TIMSS that now decided to become a program rather than a project, and to be conducted every 4 years. So we had to reorganize quite a lot. We had to change the design and refocus our efforts. IEA decided to be a regular 4-year assessment schedule going forward. By now we had approximately 60 countries participating, so it's been very successful. One of the major things we had to do was to reconsider our assessment framework and to develop objectives specific to each subject and grade. So specific objectives for mathematics and for science, and we're focusing now on 4th and 8th grades. And of course, we need a new assessment design to measure trends. And this design incorporates our philosophy of an evolving approach, cycling new items, new materials into the assessment with each assessment cycle, while retiring some older ones, allowing us to keep current while measuring trends going forward. And from 2003 onwards, TIMSS is now known as the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. TIMSS in 2008, which was a sort of a special assessment year, we conducted an assessment of TIMSS Advanced. This was, in here we assessed the advanced mathematics and physics achievement in the final year, secondary school, for students who had advanced coursework in preparation. This was a repeat in some sense of the analysis of this assessment we conducted in 1995, and it allowed us to measure trends from 1995 to 2008 for a small number of countries that participated. And then we assessed TIMSS Advanced again in 2015, giving us 20 years of trends at this important level, the end of secondary school for advanced students. 2011, TIMSS 2011 was a very big year for us, because for the first time we were able to assess TIMSS and PIRLS together at the same time. So you remember that TIMSS is conducted every 4 years, but PIRLS, our assessment of reading literacy at the 4th grade, is conducted every 5 years. So every 20 years, the two studies come together in the same year. And 2011 was the first time this happened. And we did our best to take advantage of this coming together. 34 countries assessed the same students in reading, mathematics, and science. So this provided a wonderful database at the 4th grade of data on students' assessment in what we might think of the key subjects of reading, mathematics, and science. This allowed us to do a comprehensive research study on relative achievement in the 3 subjects. We produced a special publication with 4 elements. We just studied the profiles of relative achievement across the 3 subjects. We studied reading demands in mathematics and science items and their impact on achievement. We studied the effect of effective schools in mathematics, science, and reading. And we also had a big study of the impact of home background on reading and mathematics and science, conducted by our colleagues in Scandinavia, Jan-Erik Gustafsson, Monica Rosen, and our colleagues. One of the things we had done always in PIRLS was have a home questionnaire where we asked parents about their students' home backgrounds and their educational experiences. And because TIMSS and PIRLS were together in 2011, we were able to have the home questionnaire in TIMSS also. And this was such a popular innovation that we have continued this ever since. TIMSS in 2015, another very important milestone for us, because this was now 20 years since the original TIMSS in 2015. So we made a very big fuss about this. We had assessments at the 4th grade and 8th grade, as we did every 4 years, but also we repeated the final year of secondary school assessment for advanced mathematics and physics. This is an enormous amount of work, but also I think for the first time we had, since 1995, we had data spanning the 4th grade to end of secondary school. And again, we did a special report looking at changes in gender differences over the 20-year period, changes in curriculum and instruction, changes in achievement distributions, and changes in attitudes to mathematics. So, assessment cycles in 2019 and 2023, these are being devoted to the transition to digital-based assessment, as you've already heard. I think in 2019, we first introduced the digital version, the computer-based version of TIMSS, which we called eTIMSS, and half of the countries participating in 2019 administered eTIMSS, and the other half administered paper TIMSS. That was the paper version, of course. Administering these two assessments at the same time enabled a transition of the TIMSS achievement scales to the digital world. We were able to make a link between the paper and the EE versions and take care of mode effects and all of that. We did extensive studies to make sure this would not be a problem. And we are very happy now that in TIMSS 2023, the assessment is completely digitally based, and we are well positioned to look to the future with exciting new item types, incorporating, for example, problem solving and inquiry tasks, about which I will be speaking shortly. And also, we have an emphasis now on automated scoring, which was not possible previously. And that, in a nutshell, is a very brief history of TIMSS.
No, I just would observe that doing 28 years in 10 minutes sort of makes it sound easy to go from what might be the Stone Age of international large-scale assessments to the modern age, but it's been a journey.
ドイツ国際教育研究所教授ドクター・エックハート・クリーメよりケーススタディご紹介いただきます。
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important symposium. And I would like to give a brief overview of a research program that took me on a long journey with a special focus on Japan, actually. And I'm very happy to share these findings with the colleagues and a lot of teachers and practitioners in Japan. As many of you know, and Dr. Martin has been talking about before, TIMSS is mainly perceived as a test study. So TIMSS allows, starting in 1995, to monitor countries' progress in terms of mathematical achievement, for example, and also science achievement. Japan participated in TIMSS testing in high schools, lower secondary schools, from 1995 to 2015. During that time, with high stability, East Asian countries largely outperformed countries from other continents. But what is more important for researchers, for policymakers, maybe for practitioners, is to look in detail into each country's specific kind of development. For example, for people in the United States, it is highly interesting to note that their country with small steps, but continuously increased in mathematics achievement, while, for example, Sweden had a huge drop in the beginning of the 21st century. Japan also had a drop in the beginning of the 21st century, but this drop was very mild and Japan recovered later on. So that's an interesting point
for all of you in Japan to note and to think about why Japan had this drop like 20 years ago, and how you managed to increase mathematics achievement more recently. This story about student assessment and student achievement in mathematics is well known. What is less well known is the fact that TIMSS also allows to monitor changes in mathematics and science teaching. And my example is the frequency of small group work, which was reported in the TIMSS student questionnaires from 1995 up to 2007. Unfortunately, later this question was dropped. In 1995, it turned out that Japan was rather low in the use of small group work in mathematics classrooms, but that changed dramatically 12 years later. In 2007, Japan was the country where students reported the highest frequency of small group work worldwide. So there was a significant and really outstanding increase in collaborative teaching and learning in Japan over those years. This is unique in the international context. Also allows us to look at the relationship between reported frequency of small group work and student achievement. And an interesting fact about Japan is that in 1995, there was no relationship at all. So student achievement was independent from whether students had worked in small groups or not. But 12 years later, there was a strong relationship, meaning that students who reported they had almost always or pretty often used small group work in their class did much better on the achievement test than students who reported they had used it never or just once in a while. To sum up what we have learned so far, TIMSS shows that student performance in high school math has been quite stable since 1995 in Japan, with a temporary decline in the beginning of the 21st century. But what is interesting, much interesting for me as a researcher who deals with teaching, Japan was outstanding in implementing collaborative learning, especially in high achieving classrooms. What we do not know yet, based on these data, is the quality of collaborative learning and the effect of collaborative learning on student outcomes. In order to answer these research questions, we need additional observational research and longitudinal studies. Fortunately, as Dr. Martin already told us, TIMSS included a video study in 1995 and 1999. And this video study allowed us to judge the quality of small group work in Japan. There was one important example. This teacher realized during a recorded math lesson that the students did not really understand the difference between easy problems and more challenging or more difficult problems. So he asked students to form small groups, and the task for the small groups was to pick up a problem and to discuss the level of difficulty and the level of challenge, and to come up with a problem that was challenging to the students. And later, these problems that the groups would suggest would be discussed in whole class settings. So very quickly, students rearranged their desks, formed small groups, and they were discussing the mathematical difficulty and mathematical challenge of problems they had made up on their own. What is important here is that in Japan, students use small group work to reflect and think mathematically and the teacher endorsed their work, and while walking around, diagnosed what they were doing, where they had some difficulties, etc., in order to take up this thinking later in whole class teaching. In the USA and Australia, on the other hand, we saw more examples of small group teaching, but those were only used for practicing and exploration. And the teacher very strongly led the group work. So the quality of the group work was much higher in Japan, although the frequency was still low in 1995. Still, based on the TIMSS videos, we don't know about the effect of small group work because there was no longitudinal study on student motivation and student achievement. And recently, there has been an opportunity to study the effects of small group work in Japan and some other countries through the TALIS video study 2018, which my institute, the DIPF, had the honor to develop and lead together with colleagues in the US, ETS and RAND, and collaborators in 8 countries, including Japan, managed by OECD. And this is one important finding about small group work. Each dot in this graph represents one class. The black ones are from Japan. And as you can see, the first finding is again that in Japan, the proportion of lesson segments with small group work was on average higher than in most other countries. So the student report is validated by observational data. And what is even more important, because we had a pre-test and a post-test in this study, we could study the relationship between small group work and the change in student motivation. And as you can see here in Japan, there was quite a strong relationship between the frequency of small group work and the change in student motivation. 14% of variance between classrooms could be explained by this fact. And this is unique for Japan. Small group work did not have an effect on student achievement, but working in pairs did have an effect on achievement, as you can see here. So finally, to sum up, we have seen, in this talk, I have presented findings from 3 studies, namely the TIMSS survey, which includes tests and questionnaires, the TIMSS video study, and the more recent TALIS video study. TIMSS allows to monitor trends in math achievement, but also trends in teaching. For example, the use of collaborative learning in Japan, with its outstanding increase over the years. And TIMSS also proves that the use of small group work is related to high achievement in Japan. TIMSS video showed that the quality of collaborative learning was very high, supporting mathematical thinking. And finally, more recently, the TALIS video study showed that in Japan, pair work has a positive effect on cognitive learning, while group work has a positive effect on student motivation. So in terms of the topic of this conference, educational data, my point here is that educational data, in order to inform teaching practice, need to include both tests and process data that most other speakers have been talking about so far, but also questionnaires and even videos. Thank you very much for listening.
それでは続きまして国立教育政策研究所 TIMSS 研究代表ドクター銀島文よりケーススタディを紹介いたします。
こんにちは、銀島と申します。本日デジタル時代の教育アセスメント TIMSS の参加経験をもとにということでお話をいたします。 TIMSS に日本は長らく参加しておりますけれども、これまでの TIMSS の活用ということで、ちょっと書いておりますけれども、日本の全体的な成績、調査結果は総じて良好ということで、国際平均を大きく下回った個々の問題が注目を集めることが多いというふうに、という状況です。例えば数学ですとか理科で個々の問題、今までご記憶にあるかと思います。公表問題ですとか、昨日の日本日経の朝刊ですねの記事もご覧になった方が多いかもしれません。詳細はそちらをご参照ください。TIMSS の活用のこれからということで、先ほどから講演の中にも出てきておりますけれども、コンピュータ使用型調査ということで、新たなツールが登場しています。それに伴いまして、PSI、先ほどのボストンカレッジからもありましたけれども、問題解決と探究、こちらが評価領域が変わってきたり、あるいはインタラクティブということで、評価の手法が革新をしていたり、それから動画カラフルな問題提示ということで、学習者に対しての評価問題の提示の方法が変わったり、それから先ほど、ティエリー議長のプロセスデータという言い方もありましたけれども、その分析の対象となるデータ自体が変わってきているというふうな現状があります。これらは AI 活用に関連を有しますとともに、研究と実践の双方で活用可能性が拡大するのではないかというふうに思われます。こちらはおそらく後のセッションで説明があるかと思いますが、PSI という新しいタイプのコンピューターを利用するならではのコンピューターの特性を生かした問題が登場してきています。教育データサイエンスの可能性としましては、教育研究実践の質の向上に向けて、どういったことが考えなければいけないかという点につきまして、教育ビッグデータの時代が到来しておりまして、教育データサイエンスに対する期待の高まりを受けて、まず、本日のテーマである TIMSS で何ができるのかというふうなことですとか、国立教育政策研究所として何をすべきかというふうなことを考えていきたいと思っております。実践者、学習者、研究者、日本の皆さん、世界の皆さんともに議論を進めていければよいかなと考えています。さらに、教育学という領域だけではなく、さまざまな研究領域がありますので、それらの複数の研究領域で対話と連携の強化が求められるというふうに考えます。ここで、CBT を、実施しました際の、中学校2年生の様子をちょっとご覧いただきます。
やりにくかったことなんですけど、そのキーボードにまだあんまり慣れてないので、その記述の問題とかだともう打つのに時間がかかっちゃって、ちょっと時間が足りなくなっちゃったことです。
はい、コンピューターの方が良いと思ったところは、やっぱりグラフが見やすいというところで、紙と鉛筆で受けるテストの方が良いと思ったところは、記述の問題とかだと実際に鉛筆とかで書いた方が書きやすい、答えやすいと思ったからです。
やっぱりタブレットを使っているっていうことなので、文章問題をもうちょっとアニメーション的な感じでやるとより頭に入るかなと思いました。
実際に自分で実験の設定が変えられたりするところが面白かったです。
そうですか。ありがとうございます。
実はインタビューのちょっとごく一部を今見ていただいたんですけれども、CBT のデモを行いまして、その直後のインタビューということで、実施日ですが2019年の7月ということで、現在進んでおりますギガスクール構想の始まる前の段階の状況です。今見ていただきましたように、端末の操作や動作、文字入力にちょっと難しかったというふうな指摘ですとか、インタラクティブ、自分が回答したのが見えて面白かったというふうな好意的な反応が見られました。例えばどのような研究課題が早期できるかという点なんですけれども、楽しかった という反応に関連して、回答者は何を楽しいと感じているのか、あるいは楽しいという感情が問題の解決活動にどのように作用し影響しているのかですとか、あるいは学習を成功に導く本質的な楽しさとは何だろうか、学習者の意欲と学習の達成度との関係はどうなっているのかなどなど、たくさん出てくると思います。これらは学習アセスメントを考えるときのとても重要なテーマだと思います。学習をどのようにデザインすべきか、どんな教材を準備すべきかということにも関連します。こちらは写真なんですけれども、生徒の様子としまして、先ほどのタイピングの答えてくれた子どもがいましたけれども、ちょうど左にあります写真が、日本で行った際のものですけれども、ちょっと両手でタイピングができずに、人差し指一つ使ってタイピングを行っているというふうな様子も見られてたりしたものです。時間の都合で、全部は、お見せできませんけれども、もう一つ、こちらはですね、3つありますけれども、日本語ということに関連して、振り仮名、読み仮名を振る場合があります。ルビと言っていますけれども、そういったシステムをどう組むかというふうなことも考えていかなければいけませんし、真ん中の写真は入力の切り替えの点ですね。それから右端の写真が分数の入力をどうするかというふうないろいろな問題が浮上してきます。TIMSS、今コンピューターベースのシーンを見ていただきましたけれども、別称 eTIMSS とも言っておりましたが、複数の国や機関、研究者の英知が結集した先行した好事例と言えると思います。教育評価の領域では、その結果をどう活用するか、また学習者やその対象者にどう還元するかということも重要な論点です。さらには研究と実践をどうつなげていくのか、強化していくのかという検討も必要です。よく言われますけれども、ランキング競争が目的ではありません。質向上にどういうふうに使えるのか、それを議論していきたいというふうに思います。本日シンポジウムでは、教育改革というテーマを掲げております。今回は TIMSS に焦点化して教育評価について考えてまいっております。TIMSS は、今までその教育調査方法あるいは分析手法を改革してまいりました。日本ではちょうど全国学力学習状況調査が今実施されておりますので、 PDCA の考え方が大変注目をして浸透しています。今回の講演の内容、それから日本の経験ということをもとにすると、 PDCA のチェックにおいても、コンピュータ使用型調査という新しいツールが出現したことにより、今まで光が当たりにくかった部分、光を当てることができなかった部分を可視化して、それを質向上に役立てる段階に来ていると言えます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。今ご覧いただいた画像ですとか映像の、撮影に際しましては、多くの方のご理解、それからご協力をいただきました。この場でお礼を申し上げます。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
Okay, so thank you so much for this opportunity to present our newly released findings from our TIMSS problem solving and inquiry tasks. As it's been mentioned, we're so happy to move into the digital age. So next slide, please. So as you've heard from previous presentations, that TIMSS 1995 was quite an ambitious undertaking. But Mick did not go into detail that one of the many activities that it included was a state-of-the-art performance assessment. For those of us who remember the days of performance assessment, the TIMSS performance assessment had 12 tasks, and 10 countries at the 4th grade and 21 countries at the 8th grade participated in this assessment, which really involved 100 pounds of equipment set up in 5 stations. The equipment had to be set up in a large room. And so even though assessing problem solving and inquiry has been a goal of TIMSS since those days, the problems of the feasibility of continuing such assessment really could not be replicated. So through the years, we had worked with paper and pencil to try to replicate problem solving, but it just really wasn't successful. So we were so pleased in TIMSS 2019 with our transition to computer-based assessment that we had the opportunity to explore enhanced measures of problem solving and inquiry. And we eventually developed 8 PSI tasks that were assessed in the 30 TIMSS countries with about 20 to 22,000 students per grade. And we released 4 of these tests in the PSI report. So a PSI task, as you can see, is there's a little example of the first page of one, but they're situated in visually attractive, interactive scenarios. They have a narrative or theme such that they're simulating a real-world problem or situation of interest to students. And they provide the students opportunities to interact with the aspects of this scenario. And we also tried to employ a variety of innovative response capture methods. So some examples of PSI. So now we're on this one, the possible ideas. So science
次のスライドお
experiments.
願いします。
And we do have a science experiment among the 4 released tasks. In mathematics, it might work from a visualization, a picture or a diagram to a finished product. And we also have an example of that in these released tasks. It could be a scientific model that could be manipulated by the students, and we're working on those for 2023. Often they're a systematic investigation of an object, place, or living organism. This could be science or mathematics, and we have such things as penguins or bamboo. And finally, it could be implementing a process or considering a cause and effect relationship. And we have a process also in the report of planning a school party. Now, these problem solving and inquiry tests are really extremely challenging to develop. We had, I think, underestimated the complexity of the combination of both an extended task and the programming that is needed to realize the goal of being attractive and interactive. So they took us about 2 to 3 years to develop, with considerable revising and refining by our expert committees and by our national research coordinators. And so, you know, the difficulty first of having a scenario that's culturally appropriate for international assessment, and having it address the TIMSS framework for content and cognitive domains, which was, of course, our goal for these problem solving and inquiry tasks, that they would provide enhanced measurement of these aspects of our TIMSS frameworks, and that the scenario needed to support about 7 to 12, perhaps, assessment items, creating quite a tension between an authentic narrative and avoiding item dependency. In real life, we know that often actions depend on previous actions. However, this needs to be avoided in measurement, so it is a challenge. The PSI report has results from 4 tasks, as I said. School party was a mathematics task at the 4th grade where students plan a party for their school. And they have to decide how much to sell the tickets for, how many tickets to sell, how to decorate, what kind of food to have, and how much to buy. In farm investigation was science 4th grade, where a boy investigates which farm animal ate his plants. Building is a mathematics task at the 8th grade, where students are shown a diagram of a building and used that as a model to construct a storage shed. And lastly, pepper plants was our science experiment at the 8th grade, which was to determine which would be the best fertilizer to have productive pepper plants. Now, we made a video that summarizes this effort, and I hope that you can see it play now.
About half the 70 countries participating in IEA's TIMSS 2019 transitioned to computer-based assessment, opening the door for TIMSS to build on its rich tradition of innovation in educational assessment. The e-TIMSS countries were instrumental in working with TIMSS and Pearl's International Studies Center at Boston College to develop 8 engaging and innovative assessment tasks, 4 in mathematics and 4 in science. Data collection included 30 countries and 6 benchmarking systems, with about 22,000 students at the 4th grade, and 22 countries and 5 benchmarking systems, with about 20,000 students at the 8th grade. The recently released research report, Findings from the TIMSS 2019 Problem-Solving and Inquiry Tasks, describes some strengths and weaknesses of innovative efforts to assess students and capture their responses based on 4 of the tasks. The other tasks will be reassessed in 2023 to measure trends. School Party assessed mathematics at the 4th grade. Students plan a party for their school, including ticket sales, decorations, food, and drinks. To engage students, the task is colorful and has some interactive features. One of the most successful items asked students to complete a pie chart based on data in a table about students' favorite fruits. Achievement was high, 65% on average across countries, reaching 90% in Hong Kong SAR. Students seemed to like the autofill feature, using it multiple times. The slider tool on the number line was less successful in capturing students' responses, but illustrated 2 important lessons. Although 71% did not leave the yellow arrow at the correct answer of 5, the process data revealed that students were perfectly able to move the slider back and forth. So, lesson number 1, students need to understand the purpose of the tool. Lesson number 2, do not use items that depend on students having correctly answered earlier items. Confusion about the number line slider in the first item impeded students in correctly solving the second item about how much the drinks cost. Farm investigation assessed science at the 4th grade. Situated in life science content, the task required students to help a boy investigate which farm animal ate the plants in his garden. This provided several opportunities for assessing practices of scientific inquiry. First, the boy finds footprints from 4 animals in his garden. Students were asked to measure the length of the footprints in centimeters, with 59% on average completing correct measurements of all 4 footprints. To identify the animals that made the footprints, students were given an Animal Finder app consisting of a binary decision tree. The size of footprints was combined with information about other characteristics, such as presence of toes or skin between the toes. more than half of the students, 54% on average, correctly identified all 4 animals as cow, chicken, dog, and goat. Next, the boy discovers an animal hair in his garden and thinks it belongs to the culprit. The students look at it under a microscope, adjusting the microscope to make the hair as clear as possible. 61% of the students, on average across countries, correctly focused the microscope. 2/3, 66% on average, correctly focused the microscope twice more to compare the hair to a cow hair and a goat hair. The analyses of the hair revealed that the cow ate the plants. In the building task assessing mathematics, 8th grade students virtually construct a storage shed with a rain barrel. The diagram of the building rotates in 3 dimensions and has tabs illustrating different parts of the building to help students visualize geometric figures and calculate dimensions of lengths, areas, and volumes. At one point, students are presented with a 14-meter by 14-meter board marked with a grid and asked to draw where to cut the 3 pieces for the back wall and the 2 side walls. Only 26% of the students on average correctly fit all 3 walls onto the board. The 3 pieces fit with extra board left over, but calculating the dimensions of the side walls did require recognizing that one side wall was comprised of a square combined with a right-angle triangle, and of course that there were 2 side walls. Pepper Plants asked 8th grade students to design and analyze the results of a science experiment, comparing the effect of 2 different fertilizers on pepper production. Innovative response interaction spaces enabled students to control the amounts of the 2 different fertilizers and water supplied to each of 3 growth tanks containing the same number of pepper plant seedlings. Across countries, 43% of students, on average, applied the fertilizer correctly by adding the same amount of each of the 2 different fertilizer to tanks 1 and 2, respectively. However, only 15 managed this while also correctly choosing not to add fertilizer to the 3rd tank as a control. Across countries, on average, 35% of the students correctly supplied the same amount of water to each tank. If students did not water the plants in the control tank, the plants withered and die. Pepper plants hit the right note in terms of student engagement and item difficulty. The results indicate that 8th grade students have a reasonable grasp of the idea of an experiment as a fair test, but much less understanding of an effective experiment control. Computer-based assessment in 2019 also made it possible to collect valuable process data about how students proceeded through the assessment sessions, including data on timing, navigation from screen to screen, scrolling, and the use of number pads. The timing data helped distinguish between students who ran out of time and those who stopped responding before time was up, although learning why students stopped early requires considerably more research. Much was learned from this initial innovative effort, and future assessment specialists looking back in time will recognize the TIMSS 2019 transition to digital assessment as the beginning of a sea change in capitalizing on technology to improve assessment measures and efficiency. This video presents information about the findings from the TIMSS 2019 Problem Solving and Inquiry Tasks. To find more about the TIMSS 2019 international results, visit the TIMSS and Pearls website.
So I just would add that I would encourage people to look at the entire report and to also recognize that together with the release of the report, we also released the database with the problem solving and inquiry tasks that are in here and their process data, so that researchers are encouraged to do their own analyses and find new insights about both the promise of digital assessment and particularly the benefit of very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mullis. ありがとうございました。 それでは続きましてはパネルディスカッションに移らせていただきます。
はい、本日のパネルディスカッションのファシリテーターを務めます土屋隆裕と申します。パネリストおよび参加者の皆様、短い時間ですがどうかよろしくお願いいたします。早速ですが、まず本日のパネリスト4名をご紹介いたします。皆さんは各国地域の IEA 委員であると同時に、現在 IEA の常任理事もお務めです。簡単に国名とお名前だけをご紹介いたします。イタリアのロベルト・リッチ氏、クロアチアのイネス・エレゾビッチ氏、オマーンのズワイナ・サリー・アルマスカリ氏、アメリカ合衆国のスティーブン・プロバシュニク氏。パネリストの皆さん、お忙しい中、世界中からご協力ありがとうございます。また、合わせて、我が国の IEA 委員を務めています、銀島文 TIMSS 研究代表が進行側に加わりますので、ご承知おきください。本日のパネルディスカッションの進め方をご説明いたします。時間が限られておりますので、パネリストの方々には事前にパネルディスカッションでご発言いただきたい事項につき、我が国から質問を差し上げました。具体的には、スライドに記載した3つの質問です。内容をかいつまんで申し上げますと、1つ目の質問は、IEA の知見に基づけば、特に教育という分野において、どのような種類のデータが重要で、さらにどのような場面で活用すべきか。2つ目の質問は、1つ目の質問とも関連しますが、各国、地域において、教育データの活用にあたり、行政、学校現場、研究機関がどのように役割を分担しているのか、また、各国、地域で好事例があれば紹介してほしい。3つ目の質問は、これからの未来に向け、教育データを活用するにあたり、どのような課題に直面し、またどのような点に期待するか。これらの質問に対し、まず各パネリストから5分程度で発言をお願いします。なお、時差などの都合により、同時でご登壇いただけないパネリストの方からは、事前にビデオメッセージで回答を頂戴いたしましたので、それを配信いたします。その後、それらのご回答などを踏まえながら、シンポジウムの趣旨に即して少しでも議論を深めていきたいと思います。それではまず、ビデオメッセージでの回答を配信いたします。パネリストのうち、オマーンのズワイナ・サリー・アルマスカリ氏、およびアメリカ合衆国のスティーブン・プロバシュニク氏です。それではビデオの方よろしくお願いします。
My name is Zuwaina Al-Maskari. I'm from Sultanate of Oman. I am a member of Standing Committee of the IEA. My answer to your questions, first, both type big data or ELSA and small data are important and very useful. Country decides on the data they need based on the country's aim. Therefore, having a clear aim in participating in ELSA studies is crucial. For my country, Oman, we use big data for several main reasons. First, to gather a wider reliable information about our education system and its impact on the students' achievements. For example, the data that we get from the questionnaires provide us with the holistic information about the impact of the input in facilitating learning and teaching environment in schools, classroom, teaching resources, curriculum, professional development programs, role of parents, school administration leadership, and so on. And how all these are facilitating on student learning and their achievements. Also, it helps us to compare and to benchmark our outcomes to the international outcomes. For example, IEA studies are implemented for certain grade levels, grade 4 and grade 8. Participating in these studies help us to track subject outcomes and benchmark them to international outcomes. Also add any outcome which are not included and monitoring their achievement. Monitoring achievement of outcomes for different type of schools within the country, public, private, and international schools. My second answer for the second question, one of the main objectives of my country in participating in ILSA studies is to monitor the achievement of SDG targets or working toward achieving them centrally and regionally. For example, one of the SDG targets Oman is working to improve is the gender gap attainment of our students. The ministry now has included these as a strategic outcomes which is currently implemented as a part of Oman Vision 2040. Furthermore, regionally, schools are provided with this data and initiate programs to improve SDGs targets. Centrally, Ministry of Education developed different initiatives toward achieving the SDGs targets based on the ILSA indicators and ensures its development. My answer to your third question, main challenge that we are facing with these ILSA studies is student seriousness in participating in these studies as they are not given weight in their assessment. Therefore, they are not taking it seriously. Also, some schools participate for competition reason rather than utilizing the data they get to improve the learning environment. But we are raising awareness on how to use the data to improve teaching and learning in school environments rather than competing each other. Thank you so much.
ありがとうございました。続きまして、イタリアのロベルト・リッチさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Now I think you can hear. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to thank you, my colleagues, because I asked to switch the order of our presentation. We are running a little bit late and unfortunately I have another obligation. And as my colleague of Oman said, we are using our data at the national level, regional level, and individual levels also in order to improve the quality of learning and tentatively also of teaching. As my Danish colleagues said before, the issue is to increase, in a certain sense, the data literacy of teachers and stakeholders. Now we are facing the big issue how to keep the level of basic skills of our students by considering every student and avoiding to left students from disadvantaged background. And in order to do that, we built a system with 5 levels of results, not a precise estimate, not a number as estimate, in order to improve the idea, to sustain the idea that the results have to be used not for to rank schools, but in order to get better achievement for schools and students. And we are using at the moment also learning analytics in order to find clues not only about cognitive skills of students, but also a more holistic, as my colleague of Oman said, view of the student achievements. And of course, the big issue is how to manage this kind of activities and purposes at national level, meaning from a school or from for everybody. And this is a big issue because how can I say, the constraints giving of the reliability of data are very important, but at the same time, we have to provide tools in order to improve the system, especially now after, let's say so, the pandemic. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。続きましてはビデオでの配信になりますけれども、アメリカ合衆国のスティーブン・プロバシュニクスです。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Hello, konnichiwa. It is a pleasure to be able to be invited to speak to you today and share information about how the U.S. is using IEA data. I want to explain at the start that the U.S. education system is very different than that in many other countries. And, as a result, the experience of the U.S. may not be as directly relevant for Japan as the experience of other countries with a centralized Ministry of Education. In the U.S., the federal government's Department of Education, the equivalent of the Ministry of Education, has no authority to make decisions about what is taught in schools, what textbooks are used, who can be a teacher, or even how much money schools have to spend. Only state governments and local municipalities have the authority to make those decisions in the U.S. In addition, it is important to know that in the United States, there are many layers of testing or assessments. Each school has its own tests, which it may create or purchase. Each state has a set of state assessments, for example, in reading, math, science, history. Some states even have tests in economics. The federal government administers the National Assessment of Educational Progress, called NAEP. NAEP tests a nationally representative sample of students across the country for a national measure of student achievement. NAEP also provides a common metric for states to be able to compare their student performance, which they cannot do directly because each state has different tests, curricula, and educational emphases. Lastly, the U.S. participates in international large-scale assessments, sometimes called ILSAs, including TIMSS, PEARLS, and ICILS, but these are not aligned with any of our state's curricula. In addition, it's important to know that only state and local agencies in the U.S. can collect and track information on individual student performance. The federal government cannot link any data with a student's name or other identifying information. Because of the many layers of testing and the need for protecting student confidentiality, IEA studies are not used in the U.S. directly for shaping policy or monitoring school performance. Instead, they are used for benchmarking and monitoring the system's performance in general. Let me try to explain this. Since it was created in 1867, the mission of NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, has included a requirement for our center to compare the U.S. education system with that in other countries. Congress is often asking us, how well does the U.S. compare with other major countries? And our center uses IEA data to answer these questions. In addition, our center links TIMSS data with NAEP data so that we can see how well the two assessments results align and to validate NAEP data. Specifically, because NAEP reports on student learning with several achievement levels, for example, the NAEP basic level, the NAEP proficient level, and NAEP advanced level. For this reason, the NAEP program uses TIMSS data to validate the NAEP achievement levels by showing how closely they align with the TIMSS performance levels. And state test results have likewise been linked or projected on the TIMSS scale to see how well states would perform if they had taken TIMSS. Several states have actually participated independently in TIMSS and PEARLS as benchmarking entities, so they can see exactly how well their students' achievement compares with that of other participating IEA countries. Even though TIMSS data do not have direct effects on policy making or the management of state school systems. They have some indirect effects in the US, which are hard to measure. We know that TIMSS items and frameworks are used in some states' assessment standard setting processes. Those are the processes of selecting the state assessment's cut scores to define the minimum performance required for a particular level of achievement, for example, a basic or advanced level. In addition, our center produces school reports for schools that voluntarily participate in the IEA studies. We can't give schools direct results for TIMSS or PEARLS or ICILS results because of the way these studies are structured and sample students. However, we can give schools some sense of how well their participating students performed without releasing individual data. We do this by sending schools a report saying the number of students who received each TIMSS item and the number of students who got full points for answering the item correctly. The report identifies the specific content tested by each item and how difficult the item is according to the framework's description of the item type. Thus, the school can see that, for example, 6 students received a difficult item asking about, for example, whole numbers on a number line, and the school can see that 4 of those students got full points. How the school uses such information, however, we don't know and can't measure. Knowing how IEA data gets used is a challenge for our center. Again, because the US has a decentralized education system, it's hard, if not impossible, to measure the impact of any educational policy because every school district has its own different curriculum and teaching practices. Another major challenge for us is getting schools to voluntarily participate in the IEA studies when there are so many tests, local, state, national. All of these are competing for a school's time. More and more US schools choose to decline to participate in the international studies because they must participate in local and state. A third major challenge for us are the constraints of our sample sizes. Although we test about 10,000 students nationally in TIMSS at each grade, that is not a sufficient sample for such a large country as the United States. Thus, we cannot give individual states their own results, nor can we examine equity or racial ethnic differences with IEA studies. To do that, we rely on the NAEP assessments, which have sample sizes of over 200,000 students per grade and subject. If you are interested in more details about the challenges for educational data, and specifically for international data, I would recommend the report of the National Academy of Education called International Education Assessments: Cautions, Conundrums, and Common Sense. This is a report that our center provided a grant to the National Academy of Science to produce independently on the subject of International Large-Scale Assessments, or ILSAs. Here are a few quotes from this report to give you a sense of the findings. Quote, "The research questions we want to answer and the research questions we can answer are often not the same. Some researchers have hope about what they would like to do with ILSAs in relation to their own research interests, as opposed to proposing the kind of questions ILSAs, as currently designed, can realistically be expected to answer. Similarly, reporting on ILSAs also demonstrates a substantial gap between what the media and the public want. For example, headlines or basic information on student performance in relation to that in other countries. And what ILSA administrators and researchers want again is different. They want a more nuanced view that focuses on patterns of student achievement and their correlates, with an eye toward informing policy discussions and decisions. At the end of the report, the committee notes that they had, quote, concerns and disagreements regarding the use of ILSAs, specifically to create benchmarking, that is, by identifying top-performing nations and jurisdictions, or those making unusually large gains, and suggesting ways to learn from this array of practices. They also had problems with it to evaluate effectiveness of school systems and to explore causal relationships. They noted most researchers believe causality cannot be firmly established without randomized, controlled experiments or rigorous quasi-experiments, which are typically not realistic in educational settings at this scale. I'm sorry I cannot do justice to this fine report, but I wanted to give you some sense of what's in it and point you to it if you would like a good overview of the current successes and challenges for international education data systems from a U.S. perspective. 最後に、教育の専門家としてのキャリアをスタートさせてくれて文部省に感謝します。30年前にジェットプログラムに受け入れられ、宮崎県の3つの高校で働き、日本の学校制度を直接学ぶという素晴らしい経験をしました。この仕事は私の将来の比較教育学の仕事の基礎を提供しました。どうもありがとうございました。
はい、ありがとうございました。それでは最後の方ですけれども、クロアチアのイネス・エレゾビッチさん、お願いいたします。
Thank you. So greetings to everybody. Thanks for having us, lots of us from IEA here today and from a lot of different countries around the world. I will just take a second to say that Steven's presentation was thrilling, and of course we would like to hear his Japanese some more in the future. So Croatia is a relatively small Mediterranean country, but it could represent the situation on a broader area here, which would be mostly precisely called Western Balkans. So I believe when I describe the levels or the situation state of the art where we are with the data, it could be applicable to our surroundings, but also I found a lot of similarities with the Danish colleague, and as already my colleague from Italy referred, it's a similar situation, it seems, around the Europe. So my center is the testing center for a national testing center for Croatia. So every exam is centralized here, and ILSAs also. So I am the coordinator for PROLS teams and ICCS. We also conduct ISILs, and PISA and TALIS are also in this center being coordinated from here. Having said that, I would like to be able to say that we already have a better system in place for making this data available, but nationally no, but it is good to have IEA in Boston having these databases always available for all around the world. So when we have an interest for this data, we just guide people and students and professors to international bases. This is regarding ILSAs. Regarding national studies, this is being big and small data. We also see a national studies and education especially. If it is a national wide, we see them as a big data. Of course, the bigger data is this one, international databases, but we see national ones also as big data. And a few years ago, but really a few years ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, the emergence of social data archives started. And a lot of institutions were called to participate in open access data initiatives. So my center also replied, and we signed one declaration that we are all pro open access data. But as soon as we did that, this was in 2013, the next questions arise. And this was, where is this data physically placed? So where is the technology? And who is doing the software? Who is managing the entry and exits from these databases? And at the beginning, this was grouped around European funds projects. So they were funded from outside. In the next step, our national agency for let's say informatical and data gathering solutions joined with some other institutions, and they gave a separate platform for gathering and using scientific data, especially for the educational community. So all of the faculties, so tertiary institutions, along with agencies who want to participate, can send their data to this platform, and other users can use them. These are the main positive points that we actually at the moment have. The problematic ones are the ones that were already mentioned before. And just to say one administrative one, the GDPR that is protecting the personal data also made this situation a little bit more complex, which means that our national teams needed to learn how to deal with anonymized data and pseudo-anonymous data, and how to ensure who is getting access to where, and who is opening and closing the doors on this data, and who is preparing databases to be either publicly available or to be sent request by request to somebody. So this is being put in place, but actually the correct statistics of how much is it used, I don't have those in the national level. I think that countries rarely do, because this is not a centralized system, and it doesn't have to be centralized, but it has to be maybe monitored a little bit more, so that we know how much these efforts are used. This is in connection with your question, do we know how much is it used in depth? So we actually don't know the exact numbers. We know how the situation is on the policy level, because we are the direct agency from the Ministry of Education. We say that we are their muscles for gathering the data. So although the other agencies are also gathering the data, the research data from the educational research is coming from my center, from national or international studies through reports. So for the ILSAs, and especially for the EAR projects and also PISA, we use them for the past 15 years, sort of as a replacement for a strongly framed national system of examinations. So I was so happy to hear from, of course, USA, that there are many levels of testing, and from schools to regional. Here, this is not like that. So we have only national testing that will go statewide from this one center. And this is not a regular testing. It's up until now. We are trying to framework the stronger system of national examinations that would be set in place and would be used in a future. For now, the EA data and ILSA's data were priceless, because they gave us a feedback on the situation in the system on a regular basis in regular cycles. So it was used on a national level, because, as I sometimes say, we are in the constant reform. But when the new policy came, the recent one, a few years ago, TIMSS was mentioned as a basis for changing lower grades curriculum in science. Mostly in terms of integrating teaching and introducing newer methods and using newer technologies for this area and for this age of students. And of course, PISA was used also as a benchmark for achieving stronger literacy levels, both in reading literacy, mathematics, and science. So we used the ILSAs on the national policy making level, that is for sure. the second question, the local and level and school level, we know that our sister agency, which is Agency for Teacher Training, used the reports and all the materials that we are trying to provide in Croatian. They used it for some trainings for teachers and mentioned also Pearls and Teams results when addressing some specific areas of teaching on these grades and in these areas. As far as the scientific interest and community in tertiary level goes, we tried to establish in my center the committee. Similarly as in EA level, when you need some particular data or access, you address them directly. So here also, where you need some specific questionnaire or some specific database with some more variables or whatever, public can approach us, and we are granting access and preparing these databases to be used. And we are very much oriented towards students when they are doing their thesis, either PhD or lower grade or lower level thesis. We are trying to support them in writing scientific work on this gathered data in Croatia to publish more and more, because we did one survey article where we found that all ISAs together are not that much used in our country. There are only a handful of articles on this matter. So we will do anything that we can in continuing this open door for access to this data and for supporting students to writing their thesis and to providing reports to expert and or general public that can then be introduced to the results and the methodology of this research and these findings. So thank you.
はい、ありがとうございました。前半の議論ですが、今の4名の方のパネリストの方々のご発言などをまとめますと、デジタル化によってこれまでとは違うような質のビッグデータ、それからスモールデータ、さまざまなレベルでのデータがこれから収集されるようになってきている。そういったデータを使う、どういった目的で使いたいか、データに求めるものというのはそれぞれの立場によって異なっているというようなところが分かってきたかと思います。そしてこのデータを使って知りたいと、一番知りたいのは因果関係を知りたいけれども、因果関係を見るにはまだまだこういったデータでは不十分だと、データのやはり限界というところもある。そしてオマーンの方がおっしゃっていましたけれども、そもそものデータを取るときのそのデータの信頼性、それから今もお話ございましたけれども、データをどうやって秘匿しながら、個人情報を秘匿しながらどのように使っていくかというようなところもデータを使う上での課題でしょうし、それからこれからさまざまなレベルの方が、つまり学校の教員の方々であったり、政策の立案者、いろいろな立場の方がデータを使っていくときのデータリテラシーということも非常に重要だと、いろんな議論したい観点などが出てまいりました。本来パネルディスカッションであれば、ここでこういった観点に関しましてパネリストの方々とディスカッションをしていきたいというふうに思うのですけれども、今回このようなネットを使ったということで、なかなかネットの調子も良くない方々も多いということもございまして、時間の都合ということもございますので、今回このパネルディスカッションに関しましては以上とさせていただきたいというふうに思います。世界中からご出席ご協力いただきましたパネリスト、その他登壇者および参加者の皆様の感謝を申し上げたいと思います。では進行は全体の方にお戻ししたいと思います。
ではこれをもちましてすべてのセッションを終了とさせていただきます。最後に主催者を代表しまして国立教育政策研究所次長佐藤康則より閉会のご挨拶を申し上げます。
国立教育政策研究所次長並びに教育データサイエンスセンター長の佐藤でございます。 令和3年度教育改革国際シンポジウムの閉会にあたり、主催者としてご挨拶を申し上げます。日本ではまさに今、デジタルの活用により、一人一人のニーズに合ったサービスを選ぶことができ、多様な幸せが実現できる社会、すなわち誰一人取り残さない人に優しいデジタル化を目指して、デジタル庁が設置され、国を挙げての取り組みが始まりました。これは日本の教育基本法が掲げる国民一人一人が自己の人格を磨き、豊かな人生を送ることができるよう、その生涯にわたってあらゆる機会にあらゆる場所において学習することができ、その成果を適切に生かすことのできる社会の実現が図られなければならないという生涯学習の理念に相通ずるものがあります。こうした背景のもと、本年10月1日、国立政策研究所に教育データサイエンスセンターが発足いたしました。国立教育政策研究所の各研究部、センターの取り組みを横断的に支える組織としても位置づけております。教育に関するデータを効果的、効率的に収集、分析し、その結果を活用していくことで、データ駆動型の教育を実現し、さらなる教育の質向上を図りたいと考えております。また、教育データサイエンスセンターが我が国の教育データ利活用にかかる研究、支援の拠点、ハブとなることを目指しております。こうした教育データサイエンスセンターの目指す将来像に照らし、本日のシンポジウムは今後の我が国における教育データサイエンスの進むべき方向性を考えるに際し、非常に示唆に富むものでありました。特に TIMSS ではいち早くコンピューター使用型のアセスメントに取り組まれておりますが、そのデータの分析手法は AI 技術の進展により大きく発展することでしょう。本日のシンポジウムで学んだ知見も活用しながら、国立政策教育研究所として、国立教育政策研究所として、我が国における教育データサイエンスの発展に尽力してまいりますので、今後関係者の皆様のご協力を頂戴したく存じます。本日のシンポジウムには、国内外から520名の方々に参加いただきました。ご参加くださった皆様、また運営に当たってくださったすべての皆様に心よりお礼申し上げます。特にご多忙のところ、時差の壁を越えて世界中からご協力を頂戴した IEA 関係者の皆様、誠にありがとうございました。以上をもちまして、国立教育政策研究所教育改革国際シンポジウムを閉会といたします。
本日は国立教育政策研究所令和3年度教育改革国際シンポジウム、これからの世界における教育データの可能性を探る、最後までご参加いただきまして誠にありがとうございました。